Hello everybody! The next plane off the pile is a Stanley number 5.5. Let's take a look at it. The number 5.5 is a jack plane the Stanley made from 1892 until 1962. The book value on a 5.5 runs between $60 and $150. This old girl was made between 1929 and 1930. She's 15 inches long and has a 2¼ inch wide iron. So the irons and the lever cap on a pre-1939 are unique to the 5.5. That means they're hard to find. This plane has a cast iron base and frog. They're both Japan. And the tote and knob are made out of rosewood. The 5.5 was a popular plane for surfacing and joining. The notched rectangle logo on this plane is one that I've never seen before. While at first glance it looks like every other logo, you're going to find out that it's not. I've got the 5.5 lever cap centered between what is to the left a pair of number 4 and number 5 lever caps, and to the right is a 605 and a number 6 lever cap. The thing that makes this 5.5 different, which is the one that's on the left, is the size of the logo itself. Look at that compared to the one to the right on an equivalent size lever cap. This logo for the 5.5 is the exact same size as what's used on a number 4 and a 5. These logos are 1.5 inches wide, where this number 5.5 logo should be the same as the two to the right, which are 1 15/16 of an inch wide. It's quite possible that I never noticed it before on the other planes that I've worked on, or maybe this is kind of an unusual thing. The other thing that's unusual or uncommon about this plane is that the 5.5s, you hardly ever see them with a smooth bottom. They're almost always corrugated. When doing my book, the Stanley Plane Collector's Checklist and Value Guide that I did in 2010, I tracked 1 year of sales of the 5.5s, and I found on average it was 1 flat bottom out of every 10 corrugated. Now that I've bored you with all the details, it's time to break her down. And there she is, all broken down. All the parts are present and accounted for. The first thing I want to do is clean up the bottom and the frog. The bottom and the frog cleaned up good in the deep sink. The next step, got some cut pieces of sanding sponge. That was a fine sponge, and some 4/0 steel wool. I'm going to go over all the Japanning with that. I got some loss with Japanning and rust. I'm going to hit it light with the sanding sponge first, and then go over everything with the 4/0 steel wool. And that dulled the Japanning, and it got rid of the surface rust where the Japanning is gone. Next thing I'm going to do is use the sanding stick, the 4/0 steel wool, and the wire brush. I'm going to clean up the machine surfaces where the frog sits, right here and up here towards the front. Keep your sanding stick flat so you don't round that machined edge over. Clean up the leading edge of the throat, and then go over all those surfaces with the wire brush. And just like that, the rust is gone and she's cleaned up pretty good. The machine surfaces of the frog are looking pretty good. Not a lot of rust there, just some staining. There's a look at the underside. I'm going to use my sanding sponge to clean that up. If there was a lot of rust, I would have had to gone over to my lapping station, maybe even use my scraper. After the sanding sponge, I'm going over all those machine surfaces with my 4/0 steel wool. My sanding stick will clean up the lateral adjustment lever, at least up to the point where I can take it over to my wire wheel. And there's the ladder all cleaned up, and the threads on the depth adjuster. Next, I'm going to clean up the outside edges of the bottom. I can do the initial gross rust removal with my scraper, and I'll finish it up with 150 grit paper on the sand block. Make sure you keep the thing flat, don't round the edges over. And with the edges done, it's time to get the rust off the bottom and the sides. One of my scrapers is a great tool for taking that rust off. I did a video where I showed you how to make the scraper and the sanding blocks, or sanding sticks. But look what that does. Watch, just right here. Just as quick as that. And you can leave as much patina on there as what you want by the way you control the scraper. I want to keep some of the patina, so this is all about finesse sanding with the 150 grit and the sponge, and then finish evening up the tone with the steel wool. 150 grit is done and it's on to the sanding sponge. I almost forgot to mention I like to use 1000 grit. It gives it that final sheen. And that's got the sides looking really good. The bottom looks good, but I want to make sure it's true. I'm going to go over to the lapping station to do that. I've got 4 new sheets of 3M 150 grit paper on my lapping station. I'm going to give it a couple passes and see how flat this bottom is. I can tell how flat it is by looking at where the dark spots still are and the shiny spots where it hit the sandpaper. So you should be able to see there's a little bit around the throat right there. We're talking, it's got to be less than 1/1000th of an inch off, so it's not going to take too much. I'm going to continue giving it a few more strokes until it cleans up perfect. After about 1 minute's worth of lapping, she was looking pretty good. The leading edge, it's always curved just a little bit, so my 150 grit paper will take care of that, and any other spots where it needs to be blended in. I'm going to use 1000 grit to finish the bottom, and there's how she looks after the 1000 grit paper has been done. And now it's time to touch up the Japanning. For that I'm going to use these paint markers. But first I'm going to add a step that I haven't done in the past, and that's use the blue shop paper towel and buff up the old Japanning. I haven't done this in the past, but it just makes sense because it shines it back up. And now they're ready for the paint markers. You want to carefully apply this paint to just the bare spots. Try not to overlap the Japanning any more than what you have to. Doing this requires a steady hand and some patience. And here's a look at the Japanning after the first touch-up. You can see where I applied the touch-up paint because it's a darker, brighter looking color right now. It won't be after we're done. Now it's time to get to work on the rosewood. Lots of dings on the knob, and the tote looks like somebody gave it another coating or redid it with a brush. I'm going to use my scraper to scrape the finish off the tote, and the knob's going to go into my drill press where I'll use that bolt with electrical tape on it to hold it in place. Both the bolt and the electrical tape fit tight. Scraper does a fine job removing the old finish. And after scraping the finish off the tote, I'm going to sand it with a sanding block with 150 grit paper, the sanding sponge, and then some 4/0 steel wool. And with the tote ready for a finish, I'm moving on to the knob. 150 grit paper removes the finish. And the steel wool is the finishing touch. And when there's paint, it gets down into the grain and the dings. So what I do is I like to use the Minwax Rosewood Gel Stain. And I'm going to give the tote and the knob a coat. That's going to help make sure that we don't see any white paint specks. You want to cover the entire tote and the entire knob. And wipe them dry with a blue shop towel. And now it's over to my super high-speed paint booth where I'm going to apply some clear satin Minwax lacquer. Always make your first coat a really light mist. Let that coat dry and then start building your lacquer up. I sand between every 3 coats. Next I start to work on the lever cap. I'm going to clean up the back side of my sandblaster. Going to clean up the flat spring with a kind of worn out piece of 150 grit sandpaper. And after cleaning up the underside lever cap, I want to make sure this leading edge right here is perfectly flat where it contacts the cap iron. That job gets done over here in my lapping station. And now she's dead flat just like it should be. This nice new shiny looking appearance is going to go away when I coat this with dirty oil. The nickel is long gone from the front side of the lever cap, and you can see lots of dings in it right there, so I'm going to take it over to the lapping station to finish it up. Sand in one direction only. And after the 150 grit is done, I've moved over and I'm going to use 1000 grit paper. And there's a look at the end result. The only thing I have left to do is to paint the orange in the logo. And I'll be doing that over in my painting booth. The lever cap is propped up so the logo is level, and I do this in one thick coat. And back to the base and the frog. The touch up of the Japanning is done. They look pretty darn good. So now it's time to break out the dirty oil rag. You want to wipe that dirty oil is going to stay on until I get all the other parts cleaned up. It's time to check in on the progress of the tote and knob. This was a Sweetheart plane, so I'm going to put the Sweetheart logo back on. And with the new logo applied, I'll be applying another 3 to 4 coats of lacquer and then finish it up with the sanding block and steel wool. And it's on to the iron and the iron cap and some of the things I'll be using to clean them up. The first thing I'm going to do is clean up the outside edges on my lapping station. And after cleaning up the edges, I'm using my sanding stick to clean up the inside of the slots. And a rolled up piece of sandpaper to clean the rounded ends. The back side of the cap iron is blued, so I'm going to be using a worn out sanding sponge and some steel wool to clean it up. I'm going to gently rub it to remove the surface rust, and I'll finish it with the steel wool. And that gets followed up with the scraper on the front side and on the iron to remove its surface rust. I showed you how to make scrapers in another video. They're a very effective tool. The scraping is done. Now I'm going to use a combination of my 150 grit on the sanding block and possibly the lapping station to finish them up. And that makes them look a lot better. Now it's time to move on and sharpen the iron. And the end result is a fine looking razor sharp iron. And the only thing left to do is to clean up the small parts. Small parts are all cleaned up and they're ready for a coat of rim oil. The next step is to wipe off all the dirty oil and the rim oil and give the cleaned up parts a coat of wax. There's a look at all the parts ready to go back together. Oil's been removed, wax has been applied. Tote and knob, they came out looking really good. Got to finish sanding with the sanding sponge and some 4/0 steel wool. Coat of the wax. Frog, lever cap, iron cap, small parts. All ready to go back together. And there she is. What a beautiful old plane. Here's a good look from the back side. Got that nice Sweetheart decal on the tote. And some really neat grain on the top of the tote. She's got a pretty good Sweetheart logo on the iron. Nice looking patina on the sides. And that bottom is flat and she's ready to take on a test drive. For this test drive I'm using an 1.5 inch wide piece of cherry. Listen to that. Ooh, it sounds good. She passes the test. The old girl made a nice little pile of 1.5 1/1000ths of an inch shavings. And that's it for today's video. If you're looking for a really nice 5.5 Sweetheart, this one's for sale. Time to look and see what's next off the pile, but before we can get to that, it's time for supper. Bye.